The air in Fort Wayne carried that mild, early April softness, with pavement still cool in the shade and birds moving through an ordinary Friday morning. On the first day of April 1988, an 8-year-old girl named April Tinsley set out on a short errand near home. It was the kind of small trip that fits neatly into a neighborhood day: familiar streets, nearby houses, and nothing in the moment to suggest how long this case would be remembered. In those first hours, police, relatives, and neighbors worked with urgency, but also with the limited tools of their time, trying to hold on to details before they drifted. A timeline began to form, then widen, and soon the case became less about a single afternoon than about patience. Evidence was gathered, labeled, and kept, even as answers failed to arrive. Years passed, detectives changed, files thickened, and certain pieces of the case waited quietly in storage for science to catch up with suspicion. This is the story of how one careful decision after another, across 3 decades, slowly carried April Tinsley's case from uncertainty to resolution. And if you stay with the file a little longer, you can begin to see how old evidence sometimes speaks only when enough time has passed. Fort Wayne that spring was a city of neighborhoods, of short drives and familiar corners, where children could still seem safely contained within a few blocks of home. April lived in a part of that world where errands were small, distances were known, and adults often expected a child back in just a few minutes. When those minutes began to stretch, the first response was still the ordinary one. Someone checked the route, someone asked nearby neighbors, someone looked down the street again, then once more. Very quickly, though, the feeling changed. An errand had become an absence, and an absence was becoming a search. Police were called, and by midday, officers were moving through the neighborhood, trying to gather facts before memory softened at the edges. They needed the simple things first. What time had April left? What was she wearing? Who had seen her on the sidewalk? Which direction had she gone? Those questions sound small when written in a report, but at the beginning of a case they are everything. A child missing in daylight creates a race against time, and in 1988 that race depended heavily on people, paper, telephones, and careful listening. There were no home security systems to check, no mobile phone records to map, no neighborhood camera network quietly storing the morning. So detectives did what detectives then had to do. They started with doors. They knocked, waited, asked, and wrote things down. A witness could place April near her usual path. Another person might remember a car that looked out of place. A child on a bicycle might suddenly matter. A parked van might matter. Even a dog barking at the wrong time might matter. As the search widened, family members and neighbors joined in with the strained focus that comes when no one wants to name the fear yet. They checked yards, open spaces, alleys, and nearby lots. Officers organized the information as best they could, trying to separate fact from assumption. That decision mattered early. In a case like this, rumor expands faster than evidence, so investigators had to choose, almost immediately, what would be treated as usable information and what would be set aside unless it could be supported. That is one of the quiet disciplines of police work, not just collecting details, but protecting the case from too many weak details. By the end of that first day, the scale had changed. This was no longer a brief search for a child delayed on a familiar route. It had become a major investigation. And once a case reaches that point, the hours begin to organize themselves around preservation. Who handled what? Who saw what? What was found, where, and by whom? Because even in the earliest stage, detectives have to think ahead to a future they can't yet see. They have to imagine evidence being examined months later, or years later, by people who were not there. That future thinking became important almost at once. April's disappearance was not treated as an event that would explain itself. It was treated as something that might leave only a narrow trail. So physical evidence, however limited, was collected and retained with care. Clothing descriptions were logged, statements were taken and compared. The work was steady, procedural, and often exhausting in its repetition. A detective might ask the same question several times, in slightly different ways, not because he doubted a witness, but because timing matters. A person who says 10:30 at first may remember 10:15 later after sitting quietly with the morning in mind. That kind of correction can move an entire timeline. Then the case changed again. By the 2nd of April, the search had given way to recovery, and with that shift, the investigation had to hold two realities at once. The city now understood that April was not simply missing, and detectives had to move from finding a child to identifying the person responsible. That is a colder kind of work. Not colder in feeling, because the case becomes deeply human then, but colder in method. The neighborhood search gives way to forensic routine. The map gets larger, the questions get harder. What had the offender used? How had the person moved through the area? Was this planned or sudden? Did the offender know the neighborhood? Did the offender know April? Those were not abstract questions. They shaped every choice that followed. Investigators began looking not only at strangers, but at local routines, who belonged in that area and who only appeared to, what vehicles had been seen regularly, and which had not, who had reason to pass through, and who had no obvious reason at all. The possibility that the offender was local or at least comfortable in Fort Wayne began to settle over the inquiry. That conclusion did not arrive all at once. It grew from the geography, from where April had last been seen, from how quickly events seemed to unfold, from the sense that someone had taken a risk in a place that required familiarity. And when detectives begin to suspect familiarity, the case becomes both narrower and larger. Narrower because they can focus on people with access and knowledge. Larger because anyone nearby might now matter. That meant checking names that would otherwise have stayed buried in routine records, prior complaints, known offenders, men with vehicles that matched incomplete descriptions. People reported for troubling behavior, even if nothing had ever been proved. This kind of canvass is slow and often disappointing. A name rises, then falls away. A car seems promising, then is accounted for. A witness sounds certain, then becomes less certain under follow-up. Still, each elimination is useful. Each false lead clears a little room. And all the while, the evidence collected in those first days was being handled with an awareness that seems almost prophetic now. Technicians preserved biological material connected to the case. At the time, DNA science existed, but in a much more limited and developing form. Police could not yet do what later generations would take almost for granted. They could not enter a full profile into vast systems and expect a meaningful return. They could not build family trees from distant relatives. They could only save what might one day become more valuable. That choice, to save, label, and keep, sounds simple. But old cases often turn on exactly that kind of discipline. Not brilliance in the moment, not one dramatic insight, just a technician sealing an envelope correctly. Just a detective making sure an item stayed in the property room. Just a supervisor deciding that even an unsolved case must remain orderly. In Fort Wayne, the case began to fill shelves. Reports multiplied. Leads came in from frightened residents and from people trying honestly to help. Some thought they had seen April with someone, some remembered a vehicle, some reported behavior that, in another context, might have seemed merely odd. Investigators had to compare these fragments without being carried away by them. And because this was a child victim case, pressure was immediate and relentless. The public wanted answers. The family needed answers. The city watched. But pressure does not create evidence. It only sharpens the need to handle the evidence that exists. So detectives kept working the practical edges of the file. They reviewed routes and distances. They tracked known movements. They studied the places where a person could pass through without drawing too much attention. At some point in a long case, the work takes on a rhythm all its own. You can almost imagine the fluorescent lights over metal desks, the legal pads, the maps with circles and arrows, the photos set out, then put away again. And in this case, one important realization began to settle in. The person responsible had likely not acted in panic. There were signs of control, signs of planning, or at least composure after the fact. That mattered because it changed how investigators thought about risk. A person who remains composed after such a crime may not immediately flee. He may go home. He may return to work. He may listen to local news. He may sit in the same town hearing the same updates as everyone else. That possibility made the case feel close, not distant, not hidden away in some unreachable unknown. Close enough to share the same roads, close enough to watch. And then, in the months that followed, something happened that deepened that feeling. Messages appeared. They were public, deliberate, and connected in the minds of investigators to the case. The exact effect of those messages on Fort Wayne is difficult to measure now, but the broad outline is clear. They suggested that the person responsible was not only local enough to leave them, but interested in extending his presence beyond the original crime. That changed the inquiry in a practical way. Detectives were no longer dealing only with the events of the 1st of April. They were now dealing with behavior afterward. Behavior can be studied. Behavior creates pattern. Pattern can narrow a field, so investigators began treating the messages as evidence of routine and personality, not just provocation. Where had they been left? Who would pass that location? How exposed was the writer willing to be? Did the placement suggest driving routes, work routes, or private knowledge of the area? Handwriting experts were consulted. Samples were compared. That process, too, was patient and imperfect. Handwriting can point, it can suggest, it can eliminate in some cases, but rarely does it solve a case by itself. Still, it offered structure. A note is not just a text, it is paper, ink, spelling, pressure, phrasing, and choice. It is where the writer pauses, what the writer underlines, what the writer assumes the reader will understand, and if the notes were connected to the same offender, then they offered something rare. Not a confession exactly, but continuation. A sign that the person had not simply vanished into silence. For police, that was both useful and deeply frustrating. Useful because active behavior leaves more to examine. Frustrating because even more material does not always mean more certainty. A note can widen a case faster than it narrows one. Suddenly, detectives had to ask new questions. Was the offender acting alone? Did he live alone? Did anyone recognize the language? Would a co-worker see the handwriting and know it? Would a neighbor understand the route implied by where the message appeared? These are the kinds of questions that send investigators back into neighborhoods again. Back to interviews. Back to houses where blinds shift slightly when police cars pull up. Back to men who say they know nothing. Back to files of earlier complaints and unease. The city, meanwhile, had to keep living around the case. Children still went to school. Parents changed routines. Some walked their children farther than before. Some looked more closely at ordinary things. Vans, alleyways, empty lots, men lingering too long in parked cars. This is one of the quiet after effects of a case like this. It rearranges the meaning of ordinary space. A street remains a street. A yard remains a yard. But people move through them differently. And detectives, in their own way, do too. Because from then on, every place connected to the case becomes layered. There is the place as it appears to everyone else. And there is the place as it exists in the file. A corner where someone saw something. A block where a note was found. A route that keeps returning in reports. By late 1988, the April Tinsley case had become more than a tragic event in the city's memory. It had become a sustained investigation with a persistent unknown at its center. The man police were looking for seemed, in some ways, both visible and unreachable. He had left traces. He had suggested his presence. And yet nothing had moved the case into court. That gap between suspicion and proof is where many long investigations begin to harden. You have enough to keep going, not enough to finish. So the file grows. Leads are sorted. Tips are checked. The same names are reviewed under different theories. And always, beneath the visible work, there is another question waiting. What can be preserved now that might matter later? That question would become the most important one, because cases from the late 1980s occupied an awkward place in forensic history. There was already great faith in science, but not yet the full set of tools that later decades would bring. Detectives could sense that biological evidence might someday identify the offender. They just did not yet have the means to make that future arrive quickly. So they held on. That is not passive, even if it sounds passive. Holding on in a cold case requires systems. Evidence must remain viable, records must remain searchable, names must stay attached to dates, places, and interviews. If a case falls into disorder, time becomes an enemy. If a case remains organized, time can sometimes become an ally. In Fort Wayne, officers and analysts kept building the case in a way that assumed someone else might one day inherit it. That is another quiet part of police work that rarely receives much attention. A detective may spend years preparing clarity for a detective he has never met. He may index reports carefully because 20 years later, another investigator will need to understand what was done and what was not. That kind of invisible courtesy can alter the fate of a case. April's file moved through those years with that burden attached to it. Not solved, not forgotten. The leads that seemed strongest at one moment did not always hold. Some suspects could not be placed where they needed to be placed. Some theories explained one part of the case, but not the messages. Some people drew attention because of rumor, not evidence. Each time, investigators had to step back and choose again. Do they follow instinct? Or do they follow only what can be documented? In a difficult case, that choice repeats over and over. And the wiser path, usually, is the slower one. So they kept returning to what could be measured. Physical evidence, geography, behavior after the fact, the relationship between the original crime and the later messages. What kind of person could manage both? What kind of person would stay nearby? What kind of person would believe he could avoid identification indefinitely? Those questions did not produce an arrest. Not then, but they kept the case from drifting into mere memory. It remained active in the way old cases sometimes do. Quiet on the surface, alive underneath. Years began to pass. The city changed in small ways. Children grew up. Investigators retired or transferred. Technology improved elsewhere, case by case, lab by lab. And still, April Tinsley's evidence remained in storage, waiting for a method that had not fully arrived. There is something almost still about that period when you think of it now. Boxes on shelves, folders with aging paper, a name on a tab, an envelope inside another envelope. But stillness in a case file is often only outward. Every few years, some new test becomes possible. Some database expands. Some detective opens the box again and wonders whether this is finally the right moment. That was the shape of the next phase. Not a sudden breakthrough. Not yet. Just the long middle stretch of a case that refuses to close, carried forward by people willing to review old work one more time and then one more time after that. In the 1990s, that meant lists. Long lists of names, addresses, prior contacts with police, vehicle descriptions and interviews that had to be read again from the beginning. A cold case is often less dramatic than people imagine. It can look like a detective at a desk, tracing a line between an old complaint and a newer memory, trying to see whether two small things belong together. In April Tinsley's case, the central problem remained painfully clear. Investigators had evidence that suggested a single offender, and they had behavior afterward that suggested confidence, familiarity, and patience. But they did not yet have a way to turn that knowledge into a person they could arrest. So the file stayed active through rechecks. A witness statement taken in 1988 might be reviewed years later by someone who noticed a route detail the first team had already considered, then set aside. A suspicious vehicle tip might be pulled again and compared to registrations from that period. A man mentioned once in a neighborhood interview might be looked at again after another complaint surfaced elsewhere. Most of the time, those efforts led nowhere final. But nowhere final is not the same as nowhere useful. Each review helped narrow the shape of the unknown man. He seemed likely to know the area. He seemed comfortable taking risks close to where people lived. And because of the later messages, he seemed like someone who wanted not only secrecy, but a lingering sense of control. That last part mattered. Investigators were not just trying to solve an event, they were trying to understand a pattern of thought. If the person responsible had remained in or near Fort Wayne, then time itself might change what was possible. He might age into a different routine, he might leave records he had not left before, he might commit some other offense, he might become easier to see through the slow accumulation of ordinary life. That is one reason old cases are reviewed so often. Not because the evidence has changed, at first, but because the world around the evidence has changed. A person who was hard to locate in 1988 might become visible in tax records, license renewals, property records, employment histories, and family connections years later. Still, even with that broader view, the hardest part of the April Tinsley investigation remained the biological evidence. Police had preserved it. Laboratories could test it in ways that slowly improved over time. But the national and state systems available then were built around direct comparison. You needed a known person already in the system, or a suspect sample lawfully obtained, or some clear reason to compare one profile to another. What investigators did not yet have was the method that would later make this case famous. They could not yet search through distant relatives and then build outward through family trees. That idea belonged to a later period. So for years, the DNA profile in the case was powerful and limited at the same time. It could exclude people. It could preserve certainty about what had been collected. It could promise that the truth was still somewhere inside the evidence. But it could not point far enough on its own. That kind of limit can change the mood of an investigation. Not because detectives lose interest, but because they begin to understand that they are waiting on a science problem as much as a police problem. You can picture the file then, not abandoned, but resting between moments of renewed attention. An analyst checks the condition of stored evidence, a detective requests another review, a prosecutor is updated in case the right suspect ever appears. And then another season passes. April's family, meanwhile, lived inside a different clock. For the family of a child whose case remains open, years do not move like ordinary years. Birthdays return. Anniversaries return. The date on the calendar arrives again and again, while the central fact remains unchanged. No arrest, no full answer, no courtroom. That is part of the human weight of a long investigation. Detectives feel it as unfinished work. Families feel it as unfinished life. And a city feels it as memory that never settles properly. Fort Wayne did not forget the case. It remained one of those names that lived in local memory even when headlines moved on. People who had been children at the time grew older and still remembered the fear that spread through neighborhoods. Parents remembered how routines changed. Officers who had worked the original case carried pieces of it with them into later assignments. That persistence matters more than it sometimes seems. A cold case survives not only in boxes, but in people. Someone has to remember which lead mattered. Someone has to tell the next investigator why a certain tip was checked 3 times. Someone has to say, quietly, "No, don't throw that out. That might matter later." And so the file endured in 2 forms. There was the official file, full of reports, lab notes, photographs, and property records. And there was the living file, held in memory by people who had never entirely put it down. Over time, those 2 forms worked together. A detective reopening the case could turn to the old paperwork, but also to the recollections of someone who had walked the neighborhoods in the first days. That combination is often what keeps a case usable. Paper holds facts, people hold context. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic testing continued to give investigators reason to hope, even if not yet enough to solve the case. DNA technology improved. Databases expanded. Standards became more refined. Cases elsewhere began to be solved after many years, which encouraged agencies to look again at their own older files. April Tinsley's case was one of the cases that benefited from that wider shift. Not because a single test suddenly answered everything, but because the environment around cold cases was changing. Departments were becoming more willing to dedicate time to old investigations. Cold case units gained new respect. Evidence preservation, once seen by some as basic routine, began to look like a kind of long-term strategy. And nowhere was that more important than in a case like this one. Because the evidence had been stored carefully enough, there was still something to work with. That sentence may sound plain, but it carries years inside it. Stored carefully enough, those three words can mean the difference between resolution and permanent uncertainty. If packaging is wrong, if chain of custody fails, if samples degrade, if records separate from the items they describe, the future closes. Here, the future stayed open. Not wide open, not easy, but open. Investigators could continue to revisit the DNA profile, continue to ask whether a new method might do what earlier methods could not. At the same time, they kept the broader case picture in view. The messages linked to the crime still mattered, the geography still mattered, the notion that the offender was local, or had been local, still guided the inquiry. That meant suspect review never fully stopped. Names came and went in cycles. A person of interest might appear strong for a period, then weaken under scrutiny. Another might rise because of a coincidence, then fall when timeline details failed to fit. This is the quieter side of elimination. It is not dramatic, and it rarely comforts anyone in the moment. But every wrong name removed from the center of the case protects the truth from distortion. That is why patient detective work so often looks repetitive. The same reports are read again. The same names are checked again. The same timeline is rebuilt again, not because investigators have forgotten what was done before, but because a new method or a new question can make an old page mean something different. Sometimes a recheck confirms that earlier detectives were exactly right to set a lead aside. Sometimes it shows they missed nothing at all. The case simply lacked the means to advance. That is an important distinction. An unsolved case is not always evidence of neglect or incompetence. Sometimes it is evidence of timing. Science was not ready. Databases were not ready. The legal and technological tools had not yet caught up to the evidence that already existed. By the 2010s, that timing problem was beginning to shift in a way few people had imagined even a few years earlier. A new path was emerging, and it came from a place that was both scientific and deeply ordinary. People had begun sending their own DNA to genealogy services. They wanted to know where their ancestors came from. They wanted to find cousins. They wanted to fill out family trees that had been incomplete for generations. Most of them were not thinking about criminal investigations at all. They were thinking about grandparents, migration, names on census records, and old family stories. But in the background, a possibility was taking shape. If crime scene DNA could not be matched directly to a suspect in law enforcement databases, perhaps it could be compared, under lawful and carefully managed conditions, to public genealogy databases that included distant relatives. Not close relatives at first, sometimes second cousins, sometimes even more distant family links. From there, genealogists could build outward and downward, mapping family lines, marriages, children, ages, and places. The process was not quick. It did not hand detectives a name in an afternoon. It created a starting point where earlier systems had offered almost none. For a case like April Tinsley's, that was a quiet revolution. The evidence that had waited all those years might finally have a way to speak beyond direct comparison. It could enter a broader family network. It could suggest kinship, and kinship, followed carefully enough, can narrow toward a single man. But the method required caution. This was still relatively new territory. Investigators had to make sure the DNA profile from the case was suitable for genealogical analysis. They had to work with specialists who knew how to translate raw genetic information into something usable for family tree research. They had to respect both legal boundaries and scientific limits. A distant relative match is not an arrest. It is not even a suspect by itself. It is a signpost, a branch on a map, something that says, look somewhere in this family line. Then the old work begins again, only in a new direction. Who lived where? Who was the right age? Who was in Indiana? Who had ties to Fort Wayne? Who fits the behavior suggested by the case? Who can be ruled out because he was too young, too old, too far away, or clearly elsewhere? This kind of genealogical detective work has its own rhythm. Hours spent with records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, property listings, old addresses, school histories, employment clues, little scraps of family structure that, taken together, slowly shape a path toward the present. You can think of it as patient narrowing. A family tree may begin broad and crowded, full of names and branches reaching across states, but the case keeps asking practical questions. Who could have been in that neighborhood in 1988? Who stayed in the region? Who aligns with the geography of the later messages? Who remained close enough that the old suspicions about a local offender still make sense? As this method developed nationally, more agencies began seeing what it could do. Cases long considered nearly impossible suddenly had movement. Not all were solved. Some reached dead ends. Some required difficult legal review. Some identified families, but not yet one person. Still, the larger lesson became impossible to ignore. Old evidence, if preserved well, could become newly powerful in the age of forensic genealogy. That changed the emotional weather around many cold cases, not resolved yet, but no longer trapped in the same way. For Fort Wayne investigators, this was the opening they had been waiting for, not a guarantee, just a method that had not existed in 1988 or even in the years just after. By the late 2000 teens, the April Tinsley case moved into this new phase. The DNA profile was used in genealogical searching, and what had once sat silent in an evidence envelope began to connect to living family lines. That is a remarkable sentence when you pause over it. A sample preserved from a crime in the late 1980s begins, decades later, to point toward people who had never imagined they were in the same story. Most of those relatives had done nothing wrong. They were simply part of a family network. Their role, unknowingly, was to provide enough genetic similarity that specialists could begin building trees and tracing branches. Investigators then had to move very carefully. A family line can contain many men. Some may have no connection to Fort Wayne. Some may be plainly impossible for age or location reasons. Others may fit in a broad sense but not closely enough. So the search becomes a process of subtraction. A cousin line leads to another branch, then stops. A surname appears in one county, then shifts to another. A marriage creates a new household in a town that matters. An address places someone within reach of the original crime scene. Another address places him within reach of where a message was later found. Bit by bit, the old pattern begins to look less abstract. It begins to sit on one person more heavily than on the others. This is often where the work becomes both exciting and restrained. Exciting, because after years of uncertainty, the case is finally concentrating around a living human being. Restrained, because detectives still need proof. Family tree logic is not courtroom proof. It is an investigative map. To move from map to charge, they needed a direct DNA comparison. That meant identifying the most likely man, watching him quietly, and collecting an item he had discarded so it could be tested lawfully. Before that could happen, they had to be sure. The genealogical work had to be thorough enough that the surveillance would be focused and justified. The name that emerged was John D. Miller, a man living in Gravel, Indiana, northeast of Fort Wayne. He was not a stranger from some far-off place. He was not hidden in another region of the country. He was close. Close in the way many detectives had long suspected the offender might be. That detail carried a kind of painful confirmation. The person responsible had apparently remained within the wider area for years, living an ordinary life while the case waited. When investigators looked closer, more pieces aligned. Miller had lived in Allen County. He had geographic proximity to the original crime and to the later messages. He fit the age and local familiarity investigators had long considered likely. The case, after decades of standing slightly out of reach, had narrowed into the present. From there, the style of police work changed again. For years, the case had depended on archival patience. Now it required real-world patience. Detectives had to watch, discreetly. They had to see where Miller went, how he moved through daily life, what opportunities existed to obtain discarded DNA without alerting him. Surveillance in a cold case can feel almost strangely ordinary. A car parked down the street, investigators taking notes, routine movements observed over days, no dramatic confrontation, just waiting. And after 30 years of waiting in other forms, this was one more kind of wait. If Miller realized he was being watched, he might change his behavior. He might stop leaving behind usable items. He might speak to someone. He might complicate the investigation at the final stage. So detectives needed to be calm. They needed to let daily life proceed until it offered what the case required. In July of 2018, they got that chance. Investigators collected items Miller had discarded, including material suitable for DNA testing. Those items were sent for comparison against the evidence preserved from April Tinsley's case. Then the story returned, for a moment, to the laboratory. That is where so many long cases quietly turn. Not in a chase, not in a public reveal. In a lab with careful handling, chain of custody, and technicians comparing profiles generated years apart. On one side was the preserved evidence from 1988. On the other side was the DNA taken from discarded items used by a man living an ordinary modern life. The question was simple. Were they the same? When the answer came back, it was decisive. The DNA matched John D. Miller. After 3 decades, the preserved biological evidence and the new genealogical method had converged on one person. That was the moment the case changed from historical mystery to actionable proof. It is important to linger there for a second, not because of drama, but because of what it means in investigative terms. Every stage before that point had prepared for this one. The careful evidence retention, the orderly file management, the repeated cold case reviews, the willingness to use a new scientific method, the genealogical narrowing, the surveillance, the legal collection of discarded DNA. Remove any one of those steps, and the result might not arrive. Together, they created probable cause. Police moved to arrest Miller in July of 2018. By then, he was in his late 50s. The case against him rested not on rumor, and not on an old hunch finally acted upon, but on science carried across decades. That distinction matters. It was not that detectives suddenly guessed correctly after 30 years. It was that the evidence had finally reached a time in history when it could identify him. The arrest itself was quiet compared with the long emotional weight of the case. There was no way for any single police action to contain all that had passed since 1988. Families had aged, investigators had retired, entire technologies had been born in the space between the crime and the handcuffs. Still, an arrest meant the unknown man was unknown no longer. For Fort Wayne, that changed the story immediately. A case that had lived in memory as open, unresolved, and shadowed by fear now had a name attached to it. For April's family, the shift was even more personal. After 30 years, the question of who had done this was no longer suspended in the air. It had an answer. That answer did not undo the years. It did not return what had been lost. But it ended one kind of waiting. After the arrest, investigators spoke with Miller. In long investigations, people sometimes imagine that once DNA identifies a suspect, the rest becomes simple. Often it does not. There are legal procedures, there are interviews, there is the work of building a complete prosecutable case from science, history, and corroboration. There is also the human fact that suspects respond in different ways. Some deny everything in the face of overwhelming evidence. Some say little, some begin to talk. In this case, Miller ultimately admitted responsibility. That admission gave the case another kind of closure beyond the DNA match. The science had already pointed to him with certainty. But an admission changes the structure of a case. It turns identification into acknowledgement. It creates a record not just of forensic linkage, but of responsibility accepted in the suspect's own words. For detectives who had worked the case across generations, that mattered deeply. So much of cold case work involves speaking for evidence that cannot explain itself. A note cannot talk. A preserved sample cannot tell its story. A report cannot answer a final question. When the identified offender speaks, even in a limited legal sense, the case moves into a different register. Not clearer in every emotional way, perhaps, but more complete in the official record. Prosecutors then prepared the case with the tools available in the present. DNA evidence formed the backbone. Forensic genealogy explained how the path toward Miller had emerged. The discarded items taken during surveillance provided the direct modern comparison. The old messages remained part of the broader factual and behavioral context, and around all of that sat the original case file, built patiently over decades. A courtroom case after 30 years is not built in the same way as one brought within a month of a crime. Witness memories fade, some people move away, some die, records age. But physical evidence, if preserved well, can become even more central over time. So can a suspect's own statements. That is one reason the decision to retain biological evidence carefully in 1988 was so important. It gave the future something reliable to stand on. There is also a quiet lesson here about what counts as progress in an investigation. For many years, progress in the April Tinsley case did not look like movement. No suspect in custody. No public breakthrough, no dramatic turn. Yet underneath, the case was advancing in ways that could only be seen later. The evidence was surviving. The file was staying coherent. The unknown person was becoming slowly more reachable as the world changed around him. That is one of the most humane truths in old detective work. Assistance does not always feel productive while you're inside it. Instead, it often feels like maintenance. A detective checks a box. A lab confirms storage conditions. A prosecutor reviews a summary and waits. A family hears that the case is still active, though nothing public seems to change. Years can pass in that mode. Then, suddenly, the work that looked still begins to show its shape. After John D. Miller was identified and arrested in July of 2018. The case moved into a phase that was less about finding him and more about explaining, in careful sequence, how investigators had reached him. That mattered for court. It mattered for the public. And it mattered for trust. Forensic genealogy was still new enough that people wanted to understand it, and prosecutors knew they would have to describe the process in a way that was exact, calm, and legally sound. The path had begun with preserved biological evidence. It had moved through genealogical comparison with distant relatives, then through family tree research, then to a focused suspect, then to surveillance, then to discarded DNA, then to a direct match. Each step had to be clear. Each step had to stand on its own. That is how long cases finally arrive in court, not as one dramatic answer, but as a chain. And in this case, the chain was strong because it had been built slowly. When Miller spoke with investigators after his arrest, the years inside the case did not vanish, but they did settle into a different order. Questions that had floated for decades could now be placed next to an identified person. Investigators no longer had to speak only in terms of the unknown offender. They could ask direct questions. They could compare what he said to what the file already held. They could test admission against evidence. That is an important part of old casework. A confession is not simply accepted as a complete story. It is checked. Dates are checked. Movements are checked. If a suspect says something that only the offender would know, that matters. If he says something that conflicts with established evidence, that matters too. The goal is not just to hear words. The goal is to place those words inside the record. And because this was a case that had lived for so long without resolution, the record had unusual weight. The file contained decades of labor, not only original reports but follow-up reviews, not only evidence logs but storage histories, not only witness statements but the long chain of decisions that had kept the case available for future science. So, when prosecutors prepared to move forward, they were not building from a thin base. They were building from a file that had been preserved through time. That difference can be everything. In many old cases, the problem is not that the suspect cannot eventually be found. The problem is that too little remains in reliable form to prove the case well. Witnesses forget. Documents go missing. Evidence degrades. People who once knew key details are no longer alive to explain them. Here, some of those ordinary losses of time had certainly occurred, but the core of the case had survived. That is why the legal phase could proceed with confidence. The DNA evidence was central, of course. It connected Miller directly to the biological evidence preserved from 1988. That one fact carried enormous force. But prosecutors also understood that juries and courts often see cases most clearly when science is set alongside history, geography, and behavior. So the broader picture mattered. Miller was local. He had ties to the area. He fit the profile investigators had gradually built over years of reviewing place, movement, and opportunity. He was not a random name shaken loose from a database. He was a man whose life aligned with the long-standing logic of the case. And then there were the messages that had shadowed Fort Wayne after April's death. Those messages had never been merely a strange afterthought. They were part of the reason the case had remained so vivid in public memory. They suggested not only that the offender remained nearby, but that he wanted a continuing presence in the story. Investigators had spent years studying those notes for placement, wording, handwriting, and pattern. Not because any one of those things solved the case alone, but because together they revealed something about temperament, patience, control, local familiarity, a willingness to revisit the case in public space. That behavior, once the case was solved, appeared less like a disturbing mystery and more like part of a coherent pattern. That is often how old files change after an arrest. Things that once seemed isolated begin to fit together. Not perfectly, perhaps, not in a way that answers every emotional question, but enough that the file stops feeling scattered. It starts to read as one story again. There is something sobering about that moment. You realize how long a person can remain hidden in plain sight when the necessary tools do not yet exist. You realize how much of police work depends on timing. You realize that some offenders are not caught because they made a mistake quickly. They are caught because years later, science develops a way to see what was always there. For April's family, the legal proceedings could not be simple, even with a strong case. When a resolution arrives after 30 years, it does not feel like the answer to a recent question. It feels like the reopening of an entire era of life. People who had learned to live with uncertainty now had to live with certainty. That can sound easier than it is. Uncertainty is painful, but it has its own structure. It leaves room for endless wondering. Certainty closes some questions, and in closing them, it can make old grief newly specific. Families in long cases often speak about this quietly. They may want an arrest more than anything. And still, when it comes, it asks them to revisit every date, every anniversary, every old newspaper clipping, every memory of waiting. Resolution does not erase the years before it. It gathers them. It gives them one point to rest on. But the years remain. The city had its own version of that feeling. Fort Wayne had carried April Tinsley's name for 3 decades. People remembered where they were when they first heard. They remembered changing habits with their children. They remembered the fear that followed the public messages. A case like this becomes part of local memory in layers. There is the original event, then the immediate search, then the note left behind, then the long silence, then the occasional renewed attention when technology changes. Then, one day, the announcement that the man has been found. When the arrest of Miller became public, those layers came forward all at once. For some residents, the news brought relief. For others, shock. For many, it brought a strange recognition that the case had been sitting nearby all along. That is one of the hardest truths in local cold cases. The person responsible may not have disappeared into some unreachable distance. He may have stayed in the same region, driving familiar roads, shopping in ordinary stores, living a life that from the outside looked unremarkable. That ordinary surface is not unusual in solved cold cases. What is unusual is how much patience it sometimes takes for law enforcement to cut through it. In the months after the arrest, the explanation of forensic genealogy itself became part of the story. People wanted to know how detectives had found Miller after so many years. The answer was modern, but not magical. It depended first on old evidence being preserved. Without that, there is no later science. Then it depended on building a suitable DNA profile for genealogical comparison. Then it depended on publicly available databases, where users had made their genetic information available for certain kinds of searches. Then it depended on specialists who could identify distant family relationships. Then on researchers who could build family trees and narrow branches. Then on investigators who could combine those trees with practical police work. Then on a lawful discarded sample. Then on direct testing. That is a long path. And one reason it matters to tell it carefully is that it shows how solving a cold case is usually less about one genius insight than about many kinds of discipline working together. Lab discipline, archival discipline, investigative discipline, legal discipline, even language discipline. Officers and prosecutors had to describe each stage with care so that the method would be understood not as a shortcut, but as a structured way of generating a lead that still required independent confirmation. That distinction protected the case. It also protected the future use of the method in other investigations, because by 2018, the April Tinsley case was not the only old case touched by genealogy, but it was one of the examples that helped people understand what the new era of cold case work might look like. You can imagine detectives elsewhere listening closely, not because every department had a case exactly like this one, but because many had old files with preserved biological evidence and no direct database match. For them, the lesson was immediate. Do not assume that an unsolved DNA case will remain unsolved forever. Do not assume that a sample with no hit in one decade will stay silent in the next. Keep the records straight. Keep the evidence safe, because science keeps moving. That broader lesson was one of the most lasting parts of the April Tinsley investigation. The case was about one child, one family, one city. But it also became a working example of how time could be used, not merely endured. That idea is easy to miss when people talk about law enforcement breakthroughs. They often focus on the final moment, the arrest, the announcement. But time itself had been part of the investigation here, not just as delay, as method. Time had allowed databases to exist. Time had allowed genealogy to mature. Time had allowed the suspect to leave new traces of ordinary life. Time had even allowed the file to prove whether it had been maintained well enough to survive. In that sense, the years were not empty. They were painful, yes, but not empty. The case was being carried through them. When Miller eventually entered a guilty plea, that step brought another important kind of finality. A guilty plea in a case like this does several things at once. It spares the family a long public trial. It creates a formal legal record of responsibility. And it shifts the burden of proof from projected courtroom battle to accepted accountability. That does not make anything easy, but it can make the process less consuming for those who have already waited so long. Trials have their own demands. They require repeated review of old evidence, repeated public retelling, repeated return to painful details. A plea narrows that. It cannot spare every feeling, but it can spare a certain kind of prolonged strain. For the family, that mattered. For prosecutors, it also mattered because the case had always been about patient certainty, not theatrical confrontation. The evidence was there. The match was there. The admission was there. The legal record could close around those facts. And still, even then there were things the courtroom could not do. It could identify the offender. It could establish guilt. It could document what investigators had accomplished, but it could not restore the ordinary years that had been broken in 1988. That is why people who work cold cases often speak with a restrained kind of satisfaction when a case is solved. Not triumph, not celebration in the loud sense, something quieter. A recognition that one obligation has finally been met. That is the emotional tone that fits this case. The work had been done. The evidence had held. The answer had come, but no one involved mistook that answer for repair. Some things remain altered forever. One of the most meaningful parts of the case, once the legal phase settled into place, was the way it highlighted people whose names are not always remembered by the public. Evidence technicians, property clerks, laboratory analysts, cold case reviewers, genealogists, assistant prosecutors, supervisors who decided not to let the files slide into disorder. These people often stand a little behind the visible story. Yet, in an old investigation, they are part of the reason a solution is possible at all. A detective in 1988 could not have known exactly what tool would solve the case 30 years later. A technician preserving evidence then could not have described forensic genealogy as it would later exist. Still, they were preparing for a future they could not yet name. That is a beautiful kind of professionalism. Quiet, unpraised in the moment, but decisive. And because this was a case involving a child, there was also a deep moral seriousness to that preparation. You do not throw up your hands because the first years bring no arrest. You do not decide that old evidence has no future value. You keep it. You document it. You return to it. You leave the next investigator a file that still makes sense. When people say that justice was delayed in this case, that is certainly true. But it is also true that justice was made possible by people who refused to let delay become neglect. Those are not the same thing. The difference between them is work. As more details of the investigation became public, another pattern came into view. For many years, detectives had believed the offender was likely local. That belief had grown from geography and behavior. The later notes suggested continued proximity. The original abduction suggested comfort with neighborhood movement. The offender seemed willing to take risk in a setting that implied familiarity. When Miller was identified as a man from nearby Grabble, Indiana, that old reasoning looked more and more sound. This, too, is worth pausing over, because public imagination often drifts toward distant explanations when a case remains unsolved for years. People picture drifters passing through. They imagine a person who vanished into another state. They assume the unknown offender must be unknowable in every sense. Sometimes, though, the truth is more ordinary and more unsettling. He stayed close. He fit into the wider region. He was not invisible because he was far away. He was invisible because the available tools could not yet single him out from everyone else. That is a very different kind of invisibility. And it helps explain why old cases can suddenly seem solvable once science improves. The person was there all along. The system simply lacked the right lens. There is also something important in the fact that Miller had to be confirmed through discarded DNA. Even after genealogy narrowed the search, law enforcement did not move directly to accusation. They watched. They waited. They gathered lawful evidence. That step demonstrates how careful investigators must be with new methods. Genealogy can point. It can narrow. It can transform a case from impossible to plausible. But it still needs corroboration. A direct match remains essential. That final comparison between the old preserved sample and the newly collected discarded sample is what converted decades of suspicion and possibility into courtroom-grade proof. The patience of that final stage mirrors the patience of the whole case. Even at the threshold of solution, investigators did not rush. They let the process hold. They followed the chain. That calmness is one reason the case stands as such a strong example of modern cold case work. By then, of course, people across Indiana and beyond were paying attention. The case had become a story about both loss and method. News reports described the arrest. They described the genealogy process. They described the years between the crime and the resolution. And with each retelling, April's name re-entered public conversation. That part can be difficult to think about, because every renewed mention of a case brings the victim back into public memory, but only through the frame of the crime that interrupted her life. So it matters to speak gently. April Tinsley was 8 years old. She was a child in a neighborhood on a spring day. That is where the story truly belongs. All the decades of detective work came afterward because that ordinary life was interrupted in a way that required extraordinary persistence to answer. Sometimes, in long investigations, the procedural parts can begin to dominate the telling. DNA, databases, genealogy, evidence retention, all of that matters. But underneath it is one simple reason the file stayed open. A child was missing from the future that should have been hers. Her family and the city carried that absence. The detectives who reopened the file years later were not just solving a puzzle left on a shelf, they were taking responsibility for a promise made long before. That promise, in effect, was this: if the evidence survives, we will keep trying. And they did. That is part of why the case still resonates so strongly. It is not only the fact that it was solved after 30 years, it is the manner of the solving. The solution did not come from luck alone. It did not come from one random tip that arrived at the perfect moment. It came from decades of preserving, reviewing, waiting, and then adapting to a new scientific possibility with great care. When you lay it out that way, the case becomes almost a study in institutional memory. How does a police department remember something for 30 years? How does it keep a file intact when personnel change? How does it keep evidence from being lost to routine, space limitations, administrative pressure, or simple fatigue? The answers are not glamorous. They live in systems. Evidence rooms, case indexing, cold case procedures, communication between generations of investigators, supervisors who value old work, and perhaps most of all, an organizational culture that does not treat unsolved cases as embarrassments to be hidden, but as obligations to be carried. April Tinsley's case benefited from that kind of memory. Not perfectly, because no department moves through decades without some drift, but well enough that the essential pieces stayed available. And once the offender was identified, all of those earlier decisions became visible in retrospect. It is a little like looking at an old bridge and finally seeing the care that went into the supports. They were there the whole time. You just notice them more when weight passes over them successfully. The guilty plea also changed the emotional balance of the case. Before that, the center of gravity had been in investigation. After that, it moved toward acknowledgement. Public statements from officials and family members often reflect this shift. The language grows quieter, the emphasis turns toward remembrance, endurance, gratitude, and the long road that led there. There is less need to speculate, less need to ask who, more need to sit with the fact that the answer, delayed so long, has finally arrived. For some people, that is the most moving part of a cold case resolution. Not the arrest itself, not even the science, but the sight of years of uncertainty gradually giving way to one settled truth. Again, that is not the same as peace. Peace is too complete a word for what follows a case like this. But there can be relief. Relief that the unknown man is now known. Relief that the family does not have to continue imagining every possibility. Relief that the city's old wound has, at last, been named accurately. And for detectives, there is often another feeling beneath relief, a sense of continuity. The people who began the case are connected to the people who finished it, even if they never worked together directly, even if decades stood between them. The original officers preserved the first facts. Later detectives preserved the file. Later still, genealogists and modern investigators use those preserved facts to reach the solution. That chain of care crosses generations. In a profession often described in terms of immediate action, that long continuity can be easy to overlook. But in cold cases, it is essential. Someone starts the work. Someone else keeps it alive. Someone else, years later, brings it home. The case of April Tinsley contains all three of those roles. It also contains a reminder about fear and memory in a community. When the messages connected to the case appeared in Fort Wayne, they did more than trouble investigators. They altered public feeling. Parents were more watchful. Residents looked differently at familiar spaces. The offender had, in effect, tried to extend the crime beyond the original event by turning the city itself into part of the stage. That is one reason solving the case mattered, in a civic sense. It removed that lingering anonymous presence from the story. The notes were no longer the taunts of a faceless figure. They belonged to an identified offender. That may sound like a small change. In fact, it is profound. An unidentified threat can haunt a place for years. An identified offender can be placed where he belongs, in the record, in court, in custody, under a name that no longer floats freely. Once that happened, the case could finally be discussed in a different tense. It was no longer only what police believed, or what neighbors had feared, or what the file had suggested for 30 years. It became what could be documented, explained, and entered into the formal language of a courtroom. That shift matters more than it may seem. For decades, April Tinsley's case had lived in a kind of suspended space between knowledge and proof. Investigators had patterns. They had preserved evidence. They had a behavioral picture that pointed toward a local man with patience, familiarity, and a need for control. But until the arrest and the direct DNA match, all of that remained incomplete. Once Miller was identified, the old fragments could be set down in order. The notes left in public places no longer had to be treated as the work of an unknown figure hovering at the edge of the city's memory. They could be tied back to one offender's continuing behavior. That made a practical difference for prosecutors. It also made an emotional difference for everyone else. A mystery has a way of expanding in the mind. It can take on too much room. It can become a shape without boundaries. When a name is attached, the shape becomes smaller, more exact, and in some ways, less powerful. Not less terrible, just less able to drift everywhere. That is one reason solved cold cases often feel quieter after the headlines. The loudest thing about them was often the not knowing. Once the not knowing ends, the case changes its weight. You can see that in how officials spoke after the arrest. The emphasis was on patient work, on technology meeting preserved evidence, on the fact that detectives in one era had protected something that another era could finally use. That is not just a nice way of framing events, it is the literal architecture of the case. Without the original retention of biological material, no later genealogical search would exist. Without the integrity of the chain of custody, no later comparison would be persuasive. Without years of keeping the file organized, the modern investigators would have had a far weaker map. A solved case can make old discipline visible. Before the arrest, that discipline looked like maintenance. After the arrest, it looked like foresight. There is a useful humility in that. No one in 1988 could have described the exact tools that would one day identify the offender. They could not have said, with confidence, that distant relatives in public databases would provide the first real opening. They could not have known that a man living in gravel would be watched decades later, while detectives waited for a discarded item. But they could know one thing. If evidence survived, possibility survived. So they acted on that principle. And because they did, the case remained alive long enough for the future to catch it. When the legal process continued, the facts became steadier, less speculative. Miller had been arrested in July of 2018. He had been linked to the case through direct DNA testing. He had also spoken with investigators and admitted responsibility. That combination, science and admission together, gave the prosecution unusual strength in an old case. It is worth pausing on that point. Many cold cases reach court with one major pillar. Perhaps it is DNA. Perhaps it is a witness who finally speaks. Perhaps it is a recorded confession. Here, there was more than one. The biological evidence was strong. The genealogical path explained how police got to the right area and the right family line. The discarded DNA provided lawful confirmation. And Miller's own statements added another layer. The case did not depend on a single fragile thread. It rested on several. That made it less vulnerable to the ordinary damage of time. Time had still taken things, of course. Memories were older. Some details from the original investigation could only be reconstructed through reports rather than fresh recollection. But the central proof had endured. That is one reason the legal phase could move with a kind of controlled confidence. The goal was not to dramatize the story. The goal was to present it carefully enough that every step felt clear. A guilty plea eventually brought that phase into even sharper focus. By pleading guilty, Miller spared April's family a full trial. That mattered in practical terms. A trial in such a case would have required extended public review of old evidence, old fear, and the entire long history of waiting. It would have meant testimony, scheduling, repeated press attention, and the reopening of painful memories in a very public room. A plea narrowed that process. It did not remove sorrow, it did not erase the years, but it changed the shape of what the family had to endure. There is often a quiet mercy in that. The record still gets made. Responsibility is still fixed. But the most exhausting parts of the courtroom process can be reduced. For the family, after 30 years, that difference is not small. It is also important to understand what a guilty plea does to the narrative of a case. Before the plea, there is always a hypothetical quality. Even in a strong case, the state alleges, the evidence indicates, the prosecution prepares to prove. After the plea, the language becomes more settled. The offender has accepted legal responsibility. The story moves from accusation to admitted fact. That does not answer every question anyone might still have. It does not explain the inner life of the offender in a way that satisfies human curiosity. But courts are not built to satisfy every curiosity. They are built to establish responsibility. In this case, that responsibility had finally been established after a span of time long enough to reshape whole lives. For the detectives who had carried the file at different times, that mattered deeply. Cold case work can be a lonely kind of labor. You spend hours with paper and evidence, with old names and routes and statements taken by people who may no longer even be alive. You inherit not just facts, but unfinished effort. You see where someone else pushed as far as he could, then reached the edge of available science. You read notes in margins. You notice the care in a well-labeled photograph. You realize that another investigator, years earlier, already asked the hard question you are asking now. In that sense, solving a cold case is often a conversation across time. The final detectives do not solve it alone. They solve it with the help of everyone who kept the file legible. April Tinsley's case illustrates that almost perfectly. The original detectives established the timeline. They gathered statements. They preserved evidence. Later investigators revisited old suspects, old routes, and old assumptions. Later still, analysts and genealogists used a method unavailable to the earlier teams. Then modern detectives watched Miller and collected the discarded sample that finally closed the loop. It is one continuous chain, even if the people in it never all stood in the same room. That is part of why the case became so widely discussed beyond Fort Wayne. It was not only the horror of the original crime, or the long span of time involved, it was also the method. People saw in this case a modern demonstration of how old evidence, if respected, could eventually become newly powerful. That idea reached far beyond Indiana. Other departments looked at their own shelves differently. Other families, waiting on old cases, heard a note of possibility. Again, that possibility was not magic. Genealogy is not a guarantee. Not every old case has usable biological material. Not every sample is complete enough. Not every genealogical search produces a family tree that can be narrowed cleanly. And even when it does, detectives still need corroboration. Still, the lesson remained. Cases that once seemed frozen might not be frozen at all. They might simply be waiting for the right method. That larger shift in thinking is one of the most lasting consequences of the April Tinsley investigation. It helped move forensic genealogy from a curious new tool into a publicly understood pathway for cold case work. And because the case had such a long timeline, it carried that lesson with unusual force. 30 years is long enough for a city to begin imagining that an answer may never come. 30 years is long enough for children who once heard about the case from their parents to become parents themselves. 30 years is long enough for a police department to change in ways both visible and invisible. And still the evidence endured. That endurance is really the center of the story. Not only the endurance of the file, though that matters. Also the endurance of attention. Cases are not kept alive by storage alone. Someone has to care enough to reopen them. Someone has to write the memo asking whether there is anything new to try. Someone has to decide that the answer is yes, even if previous efforts failed. That kind of institutional caring is easy to underestimate. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives as one more review, one more meeting, one more request to the lab, one more call to a specialist. And because all of those things are ordinary, they can seem unimpressive while they are happening. Only later do they reveal their full importance. There is also something else this case teaches, something quieter. It shows how often justice depends on people doing careful work without any guarantee they will see the result. The officer preserving evidence in 1988 did not know whether the case would ever be solved. The later detective reviewing lists in the 1990s did not know whether his notes would matter 20 years later. The analyst handling the DNA profile in an earlier decade could not know exactly when or how that profile would become decisive, yet each of them worked as if the future might someday need what they were doing. That is a kind of faith, though perhaps not the dramatic kind. A working faith. Faith in procedure. Faith in preservation. Faith in the idea that truth can remain dormant and still matter. When people describe a cold case as solved after 30 years, they often focus on the date gap, 1988 to 2018. That span matters. But inside it are smaller spans that matter too. The months when the first search gave way to a homicide investigation. The years when detectives studied the messages and tried to understand their placement and tone. The long middle period when DNA existed, but not yet in a way that could identify this offender. The brief but crucial period when genealogy narrowed the possibilities. The final days of surveillance before the discarded sample was collected. Each of those spans had its own patience, and each one demanded a slightly different kind of work. The patience of the original investigation was intense and immediate. People were trying to hold on to fresh facts. The patience of the middle years was more archival. The facts were older, but they had to remain usable. The patience of the genealogical phase was analytical. Family branches had to be followed carefully without jumping too quickly to the wrong person. The patience of the final surveillance was practical and very present. Detectives had to wait for ordinary life to offer the lawful evidence they needed. One reason this case holds attention so strongly is that it contains all of those forms of patience at once. It is not merely a story about technology. It is a story about different generations of investigators knowing how to wait in the right way. That distinction matters. Not all waiting is equal. Some waiting is neglect. Some waiting is avoidance. But some waiting is active. It means keeping a case ready, keeping records coherent, keeping possibilities open. April Tinsley's case belongs to that second kind, and as the legal process settled, another layer of meaning became visible. The case had changed not only because a man was identified, but because the city could finally stop carrying an unnamed figure in its imagination. That has a civic value that courts do not fully capture. For decades, the notes connected to the case had given the offender a lingering public presence. They had made him feel close, perhaps closer than he otherwise would have felt. An anonymous offender can cast a very long shadow. He becomes more than a person. He becomes a symbol of not knowing. Once identified, that symbol collapses back into one man. The public can look at facts instead of shadows. The fear does not disappear from memory, but it loses some of its old shape. The case also prompted broader discussions about forensic genealogy itself. By 2018, enough cases were beginning to emerge that police departments, prosecutors, privacy advocates, and the public all wanted to understand the rules. How are these databases used? What kinds of consent matter? What legal boundaries shape the search? What does it mean for relatives who are not suspects to appear as distant links in a family tree? Those were not abstract questions. They were part of the world this case entered once it became a high-profile example. For investigators, the answer had to be careful and narrow. Genealogy was an investigative lead tool. It did not replace probable cause. It did not replace direct evidence. It did not replace the need to gather a lawful sample from the actual suspect. In the April Tinsley case, that distinction remained very important. The family tree work pointed in the right direction, but the arrest came only after the direct DNA match from discarded items. That chain reassured many people. It showed that old police standards still mattered, even when new science entered the picture. The process was new in one sense and traditional in another. Investigators used a novel method to generate a path. Then they followed the familiar rules of evidence to confirm it. That combination may be one reason the case stands as such a durable example. It does not suggest that technology sweeps away ordinary police work. It suggests that technology can deepen ordinary police work when the basics are already strong. And the basics here were strong because the evidence had been protected and the file had been respected. There is a line of thought that runs quietly through all of this. A child's case became a test of whether a system could remember, not in the sentimental sense, in the practical sense. Could a department preserve what mattered? Could it pass knowledge across generations? Could it keep a file from dissolving into boxes that no longer spoke to each other? Could it return years later and still understand its own records? In Fort Wayne, the answer turned out to be yes. Not perfectly. No human institution is perfect over 3 decades, but well enough. Well enough that the modern investigators did not have to start from rubble. They started from a foundation, and that foundation let them use a new method quickly and intelligently when the chance arrived. When people speak of closure in such cases, it helps to use the word carefully. Closure is often asked to do too much. It can sound as if a solved case wraps pain neatly and leaves everyone healed. That is not what happens. A case can be solved and still remain sad. A family can receive the answer and still feel the full weight of years gone by. A city can be relieved and still carry memory. So perhaps a better word here is resolution. Resolution does not promise repair. It promises that the unknown has been reduced, that responsibility is no longer floating loose, that the law has finally caught up to the truth. April Tinsley's family received that kind of resolution. The police department received it too. So did the community. And because this happened after such a long delay, it also became a resolution for people who had worked on the case and then moved on, retired, or grown old. You can imagine what that must have meant. To open a newspaper or get a phone call and learn that the case you once carried in your briefcase had finally yielded. To realize that the evidence you packed or labeled or reviewed in another decade had mattered all the way to the end. That is a rare kind of professional satisfaction. It does not erase frustration from the years before it, but it does place those years in a different light. Even the old dead ends begin to look different once the case is solved. A suspect once considered strong but later cleared is no longer just a failed lead. He becomes part of the process by which the truth was protected from error. A handwriting comparison that did not identify the offender is no longer just an incomplete effort. It becomes one layer of understanding in a broader behavioral picture. A series of rechecks that produce no arrest are no longer signs of stagnation. They become signs that the department kept the file alive. This is one of the subtle gifts of resolution. It gives purpose back to work that once seemed inconclusive. And because the case involved public messages and intense local memory, the solution also had a restorative effect on the city's own story about itself. For years, Fort Wayne had been a place that remembered this case as unresolved. That unresolved status shaped the memory. The city had done the search. The police had worked the file. The family had waited. But the central figure remained unnamed. After the arrest and plea, the city could tell the story differently, not as an open wound exactly, but as a wound that had finally been named and documented. That distinction matters in civic memory. Communities are made partly of stories they tell about what happened there. When a major case remains unsolved, it leaves a gap in that story. When it is solved, the gap does not disappear, but it becomes bounded. People can say what happened in a fuller way. They can include not only the loss, but the long path to accountability. That matters for history, it also matters for trust. The April Tinsley case became one of those stories that law enforcement agencies study, not because they expect every case to unfold the same way, but because it highlights several durable principles. Preserve evidence as if a better tool will exist later. Keep old files readable. Do not let personnel change become memory loss. Treat a cold case as unfinished work, not expired work. Understand the limits of current science, but do not confuse those limits with permanent impossibility. And when new methods arrive, integrate them carefully with traditional evidentiary standards. These lessons sound procedural, and they are, but they are also humane. Procedure is often how compassion survives time in institutions. A family cannot live on promises alone. They need the promise to be attached to systems that endure. That is what happened here. The system did not move quickly enough to spare 30 years of waiting, but it did move steadily enough to make an answer possible. By the time the case reached this point, it had become both deeply personal and quietly instructional. One family's long wait had ended. One city's old unknown had been identified. One department's decades of preservation had been vindicated. And one emerging investigative method had shown what it could do when paired with discipline. Those are different scales of meaning: private, local, institutional, national. All of them sit inside this story. And if you return to the beginning, to that April day in Fort Wayne, that complexity is almost impossible to see from there. At the start, the case was a neighborhood emergency, a child on a short errand, a sudden absence, a search spreading from one block to the next. No one could have known in those first hours that the answer would require family tree databases, advanced DNA comparison, and 30 years of evidence retention. All they could do then was the work in front of them: knock on doors, write down names, preserve what was found, ask the same questions again and again. That is another reason the story endures. It reminds you that major resolutions often begin in very ordinary acts: a report written carefully, a sample stored correctly, a lead followed even when it goes nowhere. The shape of the final answer is usually invisible at the beginning. Still, the beginning matters. So do the years in the middle, and as the case settled legally, the conversation around it naturally widened to one final area that had not yet fully come into view. What does a solved cold case leave behind once the courtroom grows quiet? Not just for the family, not just for investigators, but for the larger culture of unsolved cases, evidence rooms, and long memory. That question, in some ways, is where the story becomes even broader. Because once this case was no longer waiting for an answer, it could begin serving as an example, a difficult example, because it came out of immense loss, but a powerful one. Other agencies looked at it and saw confirmation that the old advice was right. Do not discard difficult cases. Do not stop maintaining evidence simply because the current tools have stalled. Do not mistake a silent file for a dead one. In the years after high-profile genealogical souls began to appear, those lessons became more urgent. That urgency was practical, not abstract, because once investigators saw what genealogy could do, old property rooms began to look different. A shelf of sealed envelopes was no longer just a shelf of unresolved cases. It was a shelf of future possibilities. That change in perspective mattered in Fort Wayne too, because the April Tinsley case did not simply close and vanish into history. It stayed in conversation as a model for what patient evidence care could make possible. When detectives and prosecutors described the case afterward, they were also quietly describing a standard. Keep the evidence stable. Keep the paperwork understandable. Assume that science may improve faster than memory does. And if it does, make sure memory has been written down well enough to meet it. That is the institutional lesson. But there was also the family's lesson. and it was far more personal. For 30 years, the Tinsley family had lived with the same unfinished sentence. They knew what had been taken from them. They did not know who had done it. That distinction may seem simple from the outside, but inside a family it changes the shape of grief. Without a name, the mind keeps working. It asks whether the offender is near. It wonders whether he is watching coverage. It imagines that he may hear the same rain on the roof, drive the same roads, stand in line at the same grocery store. An arrest does not erase those years of imagining, but it does narrow them. It says, the uncertainty was large, and now it has edges. The years after the guilty plea were filled with that kind of narrowing, not emotional closure in the tidy sense people sometimes promise. Something more modest. Facts set in place. Responsibility fixed. One long question answered. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of answer. It doesn't pretend to be enough. It simply refuses to leave the essential thing unnamed any longer. For April's family, that mattered not only because of court, but because of time. 30 years means that relatives have grown older while waiting. It means holidays have passed in long sequence. It means children in the family may have become adults before hearing the answer. It means photographs have aged while the case files sat under fluorescent lights. When resolution comes after so long, it arrives in a house already full of memory. It does not start a new story. It settles into an old one. And because this case had drawn such public attention, the family's endurance became part of the meaning of the investigation. Cold case work is often discussed through police language: evidence, probable cause, profile, database, comparison. Those things are important, but a solved case also reflects the stamina of the people who had to live outside that language. Parents, siblings, relatives, friends, neighbors who remembered the search, teachers who remembered the child, people who had no control over the pace of science, yet still had to live beside the waiting. In that sense, the legal result belonged partly to them too, not because they performed lab tests or built family trees, but because they carried the human reason the file mattered. The city carried its own version of that endurance. Fort Wayne had changed over 3 decades, as every city does. Roads were altered, businesses opened and closed. Children who once heard adults speak about April Tinsley became adults themselves, and still the case remained. That persistence says something about local memory. Some cases fade into the background of a place, others remain embedded in how the community understands itself. This was one of those, partly because April was a child, partly because the messages left afterward gave the case a lingering public presence, and partly because no answer came quickly enough to let the city move on cleanly. So when the answer finally did come, it felt larger than one arrest. It felt like a piece of local history had been revised from open to resolved. That does not lighten what happened. It only changes the grammar of remembrance. People no longer have to say, no one knows who did it. They can say, it took 30 years, but he was identified. That shift may sound small. It is not. Communities live by the stories they repeat. A solved story still hurts, but it rests differently in memory than an unsolved one. The importance of that difference can be seen in how often this case has been cited by investigators elsewhere, not simply as a success story, because that phrase can sound too polished for something born out of profound loss, more as a working example. If you preserve evidence with care, if you keep old files coherent, if you return to them when methods change, then some silence can be broken. Not all. Some cases still lack usable material. Some remain beyond reach. But enough have yielded that the philosophy of cold case work has changed. The old view was sometimes fatalistic. If the early months produced no arrest, the future looked dim. The newer view is more patient. Early failure does not always predict permanent failure. Sometimes it predicts a wait for the right tool. April Tinsley's case helped establish that way of thinking. It also demonstrated something more specific about offender behavior. For years, detectives suspected the person responsible was local, or at least deeply familiar with the area. That suspicion came from geography and from the later communications. Once Miller was identified, that line of reasoning looked well grounded. He had lived within reach. He was not a distant stranger who had vanished beyond the map. He was close enough to fit the old intuition that the case belonged to someone who knew those streets and felt comfortable moving through them. That kind of confirmation is important in detective work. It doesn't mean every instinct was right. It means some of the broad judgments developed over years of review had real value. Investigators had read the case correctly in one essential way. The offender had likely stayed near the life of the community. He had not escaped notice because he was gone. He had escaped identification because the available proof could not yet reach him. That is a painful distinction, but an instructive one. It suggests that some unresolved cases are not waiting on a lucky break. They are waiting on a better lens. And in Fort Wayne, when that lens finally existed, the case moved quickly by cold case standards. That speed is worth noticing. The long delay came first. Then, once genealogy created a usable path, the final stages unfolded with relative decisiveness. This often happens in old cases. The file can appear motionless for years, then a new method shifts one crucial constraint, and suddenly there is movement in sequence. A family line emerges, a suspect narrows, surveillance begins, a discarded item is collected. A lab confirms what history could not. The apparent suddenness of that last stage can mislead people. It can make it seem as if the case solved itself overnight. But the overnight feeling is usually just compressed time. What you are really seeing is 30 years of preparation meeting one workable innovation. That is what happened here. Once that chain began to hold, the rest became more about process than mystery. And process, in an old case, is where justice has to prove its seriousness. The identification of Miller was not enough by itself. Detectives had to document how they reached him. Prosecutors had to be prepared to explain forensic genealogy carefully. The defense would have every right to scrutinize each step. That is why the post-arrest phase was so important. A cold case solution must survive not only public attention, but legal examination. That means the scientific excitement around a new method cannot outrun the discipline of proof. In the April Tinsley case, investigators appear to have understood that clearly. They did not arrest on family tree logic alone. They used genealogy to produce a narrow investigative lead, then obtained discarded DNA, then confirmed it directly. That sequence preserved the integrity of the case. It also preserved public trust in the result. People can accept a new technique more easily when they see that it still leads back to familiar evidentiary standards. A chart of relatives may begin the path. A direct biological match finishes it. That distinction may have broader consequences than this one case. Forensic genealogy remains a debated and evolving tool. Its promise is clear. So are the privacy questions around it. Cases like this one helped shape the conversation by showing both its usefulness and its limits. Used properly, genealogy does not replace ordinary police work. It extends it. It points where to look. Then detectives still have to investigate. In that way, the April Tinsley case sits at an interesting moment in criminal justice history. It belongs partly to the late 1980s, with all the limitations of that period, and it belongs partly to the 21st century, with its expanding databases and genetic tools. It is almost a bridge between eras. On one side, a child's case preserved in paper files and evidence envelopes. On the other, a modern investigative approach drawing on distant genetic relationships and digital records. The bridge held because the evidence crossed it intact. That is perhaps the central fact. Everything else depends on that. Without preserved material, there is no later comparison. Without orderly documentation, there is no reliable chain. Without those foundations, even the best technology arrives too late to help. This is why people in law enforcement often speak so carefully about the case. It is not simply inspiring. It is cautionary too. It reminds agencies that the future can rescue an old file only if the present has not damaged it. And because this case involved messages left after the crime, There was another layer to what the resolution changed. Those notes had not just frightened people. They had affected the psychology of the investigation. A note left in a public place says something unsettling about the offender's confidence. It suggests a person who feels close enough to the case to revisit it and secure enough to believe he can avoid identification. For years, those messages forced investigators to think not only about what had happened, but about what kind of person would continue to insert himself into the public story. That mattered because behavior after a crime can reveal temperament even when identity remains unknown. In the months and years after April's death, detectives studied where those messages appeared, how they were phrased, what kinds of risk they implied. It was patient work, not dramatic, often inconclusive, but useful. Once Miller was identified, those old efforts looked different. The messages no longer floated as disturbing symbols. They became trace behavior from a known offender. The city, in turn, was freed from carrying those communications as the work of a faceless figure. That is not a legal change exactly. It is more psychological than that. But psychology matters in old community cases. People remember not just what happened, but how it felt to live around it. Fort Wayne had lived around this case for 30 years. The public notes had made the offender seem near, intentional, and impossible to see. By identifying him, the case reduced that old shadow to one man's documented actions. The mystery shrank. The reality remained painful, but less shapeless. That is one reason solved cold cases often feel calmer in hindsight than they did in uncertainty. The facts may be severe, but facts are bounded. Uncertainty is expansive, and for those who work old cases, bounded facts are a form of relief. There is relief, too, in seeing how many forms of labor contributed to the result. The public face of a case tends to focus on detectives and prosecutors. Yet this investigation also depended on genealogists who knew how to interpret distant genetic matches, on lab personnel who could prepare and test old material, on records workers who maintained evidence systems, on cold case reviewers willing to return to the file repeatedly, even when earlier reviews had not produced an arrest. This wider cast matters. A modern cold case solve is rarely the work of one person. It is a chain of specialties. The detective who understands interviews and surveillance may not be the same person who can build a family tree from second and third cousins. The analyst who can generate a usable profile may not be the one who knows local geography and old witness statements by heart. The prosecutor who can explain all of it in court may be yet another figure entirely. The case works because these roles meet. April Tinsley's case is almost a map of that cooperation. And because the investigation stretched across generations, it also became a lesson in professional humility. The people who started the file could not finish it. The people who finished it did not start it. Both groups mattered equally. That can be hard for institutions, because institutions often like stories with clear ownership. But cold cases resist that neatness. They belong to many hands. One detective may establish the broad theory, another may preserve the records. Another, 20 years later, may use a method the first two never imagined. The success is collective, and in a case this long, that collective nature is part of the moral value of the work. It says, even when one generation cannot finish the task, it can pass the task forward well. That kind of passage deserves more attention than it usually gets. In ordinary life, much of what matters happens exactly that way. You care for something you may never personally see resolved. You keep it intact for the next person. You trust that careful work has meaning beyond your own moment. Cold case investigations are full of that kind of trust. The April Tinsley case simply made it visible. It also made visible the limits of older investigative technology. For years, law enforcement had the DNA profile. That phrase can sound more powerful than it was in practice. A DNA profile is not a name. It is a biological pattern waiting for something to compare against. If no direct match exists in law enforcement databases, the profile can sit in a kind of suspended usefulness. It can exclude. It can preserve certainty. It can promise that truth remains available. But it cannot point to a living suspect by itself. That was the case here for a very long time. The evidence was not weak. It was underpowered by the error. Once genealogy changed that, the profile stopped being a sealed statement and became a line into a family network. That transition is one of the most important technical shifts in modern cold case work. It turns static evidence into relational evidence. Not proof yet, but direction. And direction in an old case can be worth almost everything. Because once direction exists, detectives can use all the older tools again with purpose. They can study addresses, employment histories, vehicle access, distances between home and crime scene, patterns of movement. The geography that once felt too broad begins to contract around a real life. That is exactly what happened with Miller. He was not chosen at random from a crowded list. He emerged through narrowing. Then the old local theory, old behavioral questions, and new genetic evidence all began to reinforce one another. The case became coherent in a new way. Coherence matters in prosecution, but it also matters in memory. A solved case should not just identify someone, it should explain, as far as possible, why that person fits what investigators believed over time. Otherwise, the result can feel disconnected from the years that came before it. In the April Tinsley case, the fit was meaningful. The suspect's local proximity aligned with long-standing assumptions. The direct DNA match supplied certainty. The guilty plea removed much of the remaining legal uncertainty. The file, once broad and patient, now had a center. And that center helped people revisit the earlier decades without feeling that all those years had been blind. They had not been blind. They had been constrained. That is a different thing. There is kindness in making that distinction toward the detectives who first worked the case, toward the family that wondered why no answer came, toward the city that kept asking whether the file was still alive. Sometimes no answer comes because people stop caring. Sometimes it comes late because the evidence must wait for the right time. This case belongs to the second category. Its eventual solution is proof of that. As the legal record settled, the case also began to influence how agencies thought about evidence storage more broadly. If a decades-old sample can identify an offender in the present, then the condition of old evidence is no longer just a property room concern. It becomes a frontline investigative issue. Packaging, labeling, humidity control, chain of custody documentation, these are not glamorous matters. But they are often the real difference between a case that remains arguable and one that becomes solvable. The April Tinsley investigation highlighted that truth in very concrete ways. The evidence had not merely survived in a technical sense. It had survived in a usable, reliable, courtroom credible form. That is harder than it sounds. Old cases passed through many administrative seasons, budget pressure, office moves, personnel changes, updated procedures, new filing systems, retirements. Each one creates a chance for confusion, and confusion is the enemy of old evidence. So when a case like this reaches resolution, it quietly honors every stage where confusion was resisted. Every time a clerk matched the item to the report correctly. Every time a detective documented a transfer. Every time a supervisor insisted that the old file remain orderly. Those acts are small on the day they occur. Years later, they become enormous. Because the story was so public, another effect followed. People outside law enforcement began to understand cold cases differently. For many, an unsolved case had once suggested failure in a simple sense. No arrest meant no progress. But the April Tinsley case showed that progress can exist in hidden forms. Evidence can be kept ready. Theory can become sharper. Technology can catch up. A profile can wait without becoming worthless. This is a more patient understanding of justice. Not faster, not more comforting in the short term, but truer to how long investigations actually work. The case also sharpened a question that often sits quietly in the background of cold case discussions. How many other names are still waiting in boxes? How many cases contain material that could matter once the right method is applied? How many families are living through the same suspended years that the Tinsley family endured? That question does not have an easy answer. But one solved case can make it harder to look away from the rest. When you know that 30 years of silence can be broken, silence begins to feel less final. It becomes a challenge. Perhaps that is one reason people return to this case so often. It is specific and local, but it also gestures outward. It points toward many other shelves, many other envelopes, many other files with dates from another era. Some of those cases may never yield. Some may lack the preserved evidence needed to move forward, but some may be waiting in exactly the same quiet way this one once waited. That thought gives the case a strange afterlife. It remains solved, yes, but it also continues to work in the imagination of investigators, not as mystery now, as possibility. And in that sense, the April Tinsley case did not simply end when Miller pleaded guilty. It changed function. It moved from active investigation into example. Example for departments. Example for cold case units. Example for prosecutors thinking about how to explain genealogy. Example for families trying to decide whether hope after many years is naive or reasonable. That last part matters very much. Hope in an old case is complicated. Too much hope can be cruel if it turns every small development into a promise. Too little hope can become another kind of cruelty if it tells families that time has already done its worst and nothing more can be expected. What this case offers is a quieter kind of hope. Not hope based on fantasy, hope based on preservation, method, and patience. A realistic hope, one that says the future may not arrive quickly, but it can still arrive usefully. There are also lessons here about narration itself, about how to tell an old case without flattening it into a single miracle of technology. It would be easy to summarize the entire story by saying that genealogy solved it. There is truth in that, but not enough truth. Genealogy opened the final path. It did not create the evidence from nothing. It did not preserve the case for 30 years. It did not conduct the original search, gather the first statements, study the messages, review suspects in the decades before, or maintain the chain of custody. All of those things came first. So the better way to tell the story is more layered. A case was solved by old evidence, patient record keeping, evolving DNA science, forensic genealogy, careful surveillance, direct comparison, and a legal process strong enough to carry the result into court. That is a long answer. What remained after all of that was the meaning of patience. It is easy to admire the final result because results are clear. An arrest is clear. A guilty plea is clear. A solved case can be pointed to, dated, filed, and remembered. But the work that made this possible was mostly unclear while it was happening. For years, it must have looked like the case was standing still. Detectives reviewed names and found nothing final. Laboratories preserved samples and reported no direct match. Cold case officers reopened the file and closed it again. Not because they were done, but because the next useful step still had not arrived. That is the part of the story that matters so much. The case did not survive because people felt certain. It survived because people behaved as if uncertainty did not excuse giving up. That may be the deepest lesson Fort Wayne was left with. You keep the file in order, you keep the evidence safe, you write things down so the next person can understand them. You do not confuse delay with defeat. And when a city carries a case for that long, the answer belongs not only to the moment of arrest, but to every year in between. April Tinsley's name stayed present through those years. Not every day, perhaps, not always in headlines, but in memory, in department records, in conversations between investigators, in the private lives of family members who never had the option of setting the case aside. That is another reason the resolution mattered so much. It did not create concern where none had existed. It answered concern that had endured for 30 years. And in that answer, the city could finally begin to separate memory from uncertainty. That distinction is important. Memory remains. It should remain. A child should not disappear into the archive merely because a case is solved. But uncertainty is different. Uncertainty keeps moving. It unsettles every anniversary. It leaves room for old fear to keep breathing. Once Miller was identified, once the DNA match was confirmed, once the guilty plea was entered, that uncertainty narrowed. Not every question vanished. But the central one did. Who did this? After 30 years, Fort Wayne could finally answer that plainly. There is a kind of quiet power in plain answers. They do not heal everything. They do not restore time. But they stop the endless circling of the mind around one missing fact. For April's family, that mattered in ways no public statement could fully contain. The law had caught up to the truth. Late, painfully late, but still. And the lateness itself became part of the meaning, because this was not a case solved by speed. It was solved by endurance. Endurance in evidence rooms, endurance in databases, endurance in cold case review, endurance in family memory, endurance in the belief that a preserved sample from 1988 might still speak in the 21st century. It did speak, and when it did, it said something very exact. Not just the name of one offender. It also said that old evidence is not old in the way people sometimes imagine. If cared for properly, it does not become less truthful with time. In some cases, it becomes more useful. That is a remarkable idea, really. A sealed envelope can wait more patiently than any person can. A lab sample does not grow tired. A report does not forget its date. If human beings do their part, preserving, labeling, returning, checking, the evidence can outlast the error that first collected it. April Tinsley's case proved that with unusual force, and because it did, it entered a larger history of cold case work. Investigators across the country looked at it and saw a pattern that could apply elsewhere. Not everywhere, not every case has biological evidence. Not every sample has survived. Not every genealogy search will narrow cleanly, but enough do. Enough can. Enough to change how old files are viewed. A box on a shelf is not merely a record of failure. Sometimes it is a case waiting for a future method. That shift in thinking may be one of the most lasting things April's case left behind. The police department in Fort Wayne solved one crime, but in doing so, it also demonstrated a philosophy. Preservation is not passive. Order is not clerical trivia. Cold case review is not just ritual. These are active forms of justice. Slow forms, yes, often invisible forms, but active all the same. And once you see the case through that lens, even the long empty stretches look different. The years without an arrest were not wasted years. They were years in which the file remained available to be solved. That is not the same thing as resolution, but it is what made resolution possible. There is something almost humbling in that. The people who first collected the evidence could not know who would one day use it. The people who maintained the file could not know exactly which new method would matter. The genealogists who later built family trees could not have done their work without earlier discipline they never witnessed. Each group depended on the others. That chain of dependence is worth honoring because it tells the truth about how justice often works when it arrives late. Not as one heroic act, as cooperation spread across time, a detective in one decade, a technician in another, a genealogist much later, a surveillance team waiting quietly in a car, a lab comparing old material to new. A prosecutor arranging it all into a form the court can accept. None of those steps is the whole story. Together, they become the story. And perhaps that is why this case lingers in the mind even after it is solved. Not because it remains mysterious in the old way, but because it reveals how many ordinary people doing careful, ordinary work can hold open the possibility of truth. There is comfort in that, of a sort. Not comfort about what happened. Nothing comfortable sits there, but comfort in the idea that neglect did not win. Time passed. Time did what time always does. It altered faces. It moved families through birthdays and losses and long waiting, but it did not erase the case. That is a meaningful distinction. Erasure is one kind of loss. Delay is another. This case suffered delay. It did not suffer erasure. That is why the final answer could still arrive. By the time Miller pleaded guilty, the case had already changed many of the people around it. It had shaped careers. It had shaped a city's memory. It had shaped family life for decades. The plea did not undo any of that. What it did was place a legal marker at the end of one long road. This happened. This man was responsible. This file, carried for 30 years, has reached its formal conclusion. Formal conclusion is not the same as emotional end. It never is. Families go on carrying absence. Communities go on carrying memory. Investigators go on thinking about the parts that could never be fully restored. But a formal conclusion matters. It means the law has done what it could do. It means the record no longer lives in speculation. It means that one child's case was not abandoned to the convenience of time. That may be as close to justice as an old case can come. Not perfect justice, not complete, but real. And when people say that April Tinsley's case was solved after 30 years, that phrase contains more than it first appears to. Solved means identified. Solved means confirmed. Solved means admitted. Solved means preserved evidence met new science and held. Solved means that dozens of decisions, made by people who could not yet see the ending, turned out to matter. Solved also means something else, something quieter. It means that for 30 years the file remained part of the moral life of the institutions that held it. Someone kept saying, in effect, not yet, but not never. That is a hard sentence to live inside. Families know that, detectives know that, cities know that. Not yet can last an unbearably long time. But not never is still different, and in this case it was true. The answer came. The strange public messages that had once seemed like proof of untouchable anonymity were folded back into the record of one identified offender. The biological evidence that had once been too advanced for its own era became exactly the thing that reached across time. The local theory that detectives had built through geography and behavior turned out to be broadly right. The patient waiting, the rechecking, the shelving and unshelving of the file, the quiet refusal to let it become disordered, all of it led somewhere. That somewhere was not peace, but it was truth. And truth, when delayed that long, has its own weight. It lands differently, more gently perhaps than people imagine. There is no single dramatic instant that can contain 30 years. Instead, the answer settles into court documents, into police memory, into family history, into the way a city tells the story of one spring day and all the years that followed. If you sit with the case now, long after the arrest, long after the plea, that may be what stays with you most. Not the novelty of genealogy, though that mattered. Not even the surprise that the offender had remained nearby. What stays is the structure of care, a system that remembered, a family that endured, a set of facts that waited, and a truth that finally became visible because no one had allowed it to be lost. There are still mysteries in the world that sit in boxes, still names missing from old files, still evidence waiting for the right question, the right method, the right patient investigator willing to open the folder one more time. The April Tinsley case cannot answer those cases for us, but it can stand beside them quietly, as proof that some long silences are not empty, they are only unfinished. That is a modest kind of hope. It asks for discipline, not fantasy. It asks for evidence rooms to be orderly, for records to be clear, for investigators to resist the temptation to call a file dead just because it is old, and for families, when they can bear it, to understand that waiting is not always the same thing as being forgotten. April was not forgotten. The file proves that. The arrest proved it again. The guilty plea made it official. And now what remains is remembrance. Not of the offender, really. He belongs to the record, and there he can stay. What remains is the image from the beginning. A neighborhood day. A short errand. A child who should have come home. Everything that followed. The search, the notes, the decades, the science, the arrest followed from that interruption. So it is right, in the end, to return gently to her. to the child at the center of the case, to the family who carried her name through all those years, to the ordinary acts of care that kept one answer possible when many people might have assumed it was gone. The file is closed now. The shelves are quieter. The evidence has said what it could say. The court has said what it could say too. Still, some questions remain beyond the reach of records. How a city carries fear for so long. How a family carries waiting. How many old cases are still resting patiently in the dark, asking only that someone remember to look again. For tonight, those questions can rest where they are. They don't have to be solved all at once. April's case was answered slowly, by people who stayed with it, by evidence that endured, by time itself finally turning and offering one clear name. And now the long search is over. The long uncertainty is over. What